Kelly M. Ray knelt in the dirt of the Nordine rose garden, knees aching against cold stone, stomach twisting with hunger he'd chosen for himself. 3 days without a proper meal. 3 days of blistered palms and a screaming spine. He could have stood, straightened his shoulders, and let the truth ripple through the estate like wildfire. Instead, he stayed silent, cloaked in rags, watching the wealthy glide past as though he were just another fixture of the grounds. Beneath the grime, the Duke of Ravenscroft was running the cruelest experiment of his life. Could anyone here still see him as human? More concise and shortly. Hello, golden-hearted wanderer. Where's your evening light fading tonight? Lagos, Virginia, Scotland, or under the stars in Australia, Texas, or Toronto? Drop it below. If these slow-burn tales of hidden passions move you, hit like, subscribe to Hearts Buried in Gold, and let's uncover more together. Now lean close. The Nordine estate sprawled in golden light, its rose gardens crowded with pink and crimson blooms, where servants and gentry passed without a glance at the gardener working himself to exhaustion among the thorns. Kelly had planned this deception for weeks, ignoring his butler Arthur's warnings that starving himself to test society's conscience bordered on madness. But Kelly was weary of ballrooms full of women who recited his title like a prayer and calculated his fortune before learning his favorite color. He wanted proof, not flattery, wanted to know what remained of a person's decency once wealth left the equation. What he hadn't expected was how quickly cruelty would show itself, nor that the one soul who'd notice his suffering would be a woman with everything to lose and nothing to gain. The morning sun climbed higher over the Nordine estate, gilding the rose beds in amber light that did nothing to warm the ache in Kelly's back. He had been kneeling since dawn, fingers raw from turning soil, his borrowed shirt clinging to his skin with sweat and grime he'd rubbed in himself the night before. Hunger gnawed at him steadily now, a dull persistent throb beneath his ribs, and he welcomed it the way a man welcomes proof of his own convictions. This was the truth he had come to find, and the truth, he was quickly learning, was uglier than he'd imagined. He heard them before he saw them. Light laughter, the rustle of silk, the clip of polished boots against stone. A cluster of estate guests strolled the garden path, parasols tilted against the sun, voices pitched in the easy, careless register of people who had never once wondered where their next meal would come from. Kelly kept his head down, hands buried in the dirt, and let them pass. None looked at him. He might as well have been one of the rose bushes. Then came Clara Nordine, sweeping past in emerald silk, her nose wrinkling as though the garden itself had begun to smell of him. Honestly, she said to no one in particular, though pitched precisely so he would hear it, the state of the help these days. Filthy creature. Someone ought to hose him down before he ruins the roses with whatever's crawling on him. Kelly said nothing. He had trained himself for this, had told himself the insults would mean nothing, that he was gathering evidence, not absorbing wounds. But something in him tightened anyway, some quiet, stubborn part of his pride that had never once in his life been spoken to this way. Worse was her son. Arthur Nordine ambled over with the loose, entitled swagger of a young man who had never been told no, surveying Kelly's spade and shears laid neatly in the grass. He studied them for a moment, too long, too deliberately, before planting his boot squarely across the spade's handle and grinding his heel until the wood cracked. "Careless of you," Arthur said, not troubling to hide his smirk, "leaving your tools where a gentleman might trip." He walked on without waiting for a response, as though Kelly's existence required none. Kelly stared at the splintered handle in the grass, at the dirt beneath his fingernails, at the emptiness in his stomach that had gone past pain into something numb. This was what wealth did to people, he thought. It didn't just insulate them from suffering. It made suffering invisible to them, beneath their notice, beneath their care. He had suspected as much for years. Now he had proof, cracked and lying in the grass like the tool at his feet. He picked up the broken spade and kept working. By mid-afternoon, the hunger had stopped feeling like hunger at all. It had become something heavier, a fog settling behind Kelly's eyes, blurring the edges of the rose beds until the pink and crimson blurred into a single trembling color. His hands, still moving through the motions of pulling weeds, had begun to shake. He told himself it was nothing, that he had endured worse in his life, though in truth he never had. Not like this. Not with his body betraying the careful performance he'd built around it. The world tilted. He caught himself on his knees, one palm pressed flat against the warm stone path, breath coming shallow and fast. For a moment, he thought he might simply fold sideways into the dirt and let the estate discover exactly who they'd been stepping over. Wouldn't that be a fitting end to his little experiment? He thought bitterly. The Duke of Ravenscroft, found unconscious in a flower bed, undone by his own pride. You look as though you're about to faint. The voice was quiet, unhurried, without a trace of the mockery he'd come to expect. Kelly lifted his head and found a young woman crouched beside him, close enough that he could see the concern gathering plainly across her face. She wore a simple yellow dress, plain compared to the silks that had swept past him all morning, and she carried a woven basket over one arm as though she'd been walking the garden with purpose rather than idle amusement. "I'm fine," Kelly managed, though his voice betrayed him, thin and unconvincing. She didn't argue. She simply knelt beside him on the stone, careless of the dirt against her skirts, and drew back the cloth covering her basket. Inside sat a loaf of bread, still faintly warm, and a small block of cheese she'd clearly meant for someone else entirely. She tore a portion free and pressed it into his hands before he could protest, then filled a tin cup from a flask of water and held it out to him with a steadiness that suggested this was not the first act of quiet defiance she'd ever performed. "Eat," she said simply. "No one should go hungry on this estate. Whatever they tell you about your place here, it isn't true." Kelly stared at the bread in his trembling hands, then at her, at the plainness of her kindness, offered without hesitation, without calculation, without a single glance toward what it might cost her to be seen helping him. Something in his chest cracked open, quiet and unguarded, in a way none of Clara's insults or Arthur's cruelty had managed to touch. "Thank you," he said, and meant it more deeply than she could possibly have understood. She only smiled, gathered her basket, and rose to leave, as though she had done nothing at all remarkable. The visits became a rhythm Kelly found himself counting the hours toward, though he would never have admitted such a thing aloud. Every few days, sometimes more often, Brenda slipped away from the main house with her basket tucked against her hip, weaving through the hedges with the practiced ease of someone who had long ago learned which paths kept her hidden from watchful eyes. She always found him among the roses, and she always came bearing something. Bread still warm from the kitchen, a wedge of cheese wrapped in cloth, once even a small jar of honey she confessed to having taken without asking. "You'll get caught," Kelly told her one afternoon, though he made no move to discourage her. "Only if I'm careless," she said, settling onto the low stone bench beside the rose beds as though it were the most natural thing in the world. "And I've had a great deal of practice not being careless." He asked her, once, why she bothered. Why a woman with her own hardships, her own precarious place in a family that clearly valued her little, would risk anything at all for a stranger who owned nothing and offered less. She'd looked at him, then with an expression he hadn't expected, something between confusion and quiet conviction. "Because you're hungry," she said simply, "and I have bread. I don't see what else there is to consider." It was the plainness of her logic that undid him most. In the ballrooms of his own world, kindness was never simple. It was calculated, weighed, exchanged for something in return, a favor, a connection, a foothold toward his fortune. Every woman he'd ever danced with had measured her warmth against his worth. But Brenda measured nothing. She spoke to him as though he were simply a person, worthy of decency, because decency cost her something, and she chose to spend it anyway. Over the weeks, their conversations deepened past bread and water into something Kelly hadn't realized he'd been starving for far longer than his stomach had. She told him about her mother, gone 5 years now, and the ache of living under her Aunt Clara's roof, tolerated rather than loved. He told her half-truths about a family that had cast him out, weaving just enough fiction to protect his secret while keeping the emotion beneath it painfully real. She spoke of wanting, someday, a life built on something steadier than other people's approval. He listened, and found himself wanting the very same thing, though he'd spent years convinced it was impossible for a man in his position. Sitting among the roses with her, dirt still beneath his fingernails, Kelly began to understand that he had built his entire life around people who saw his title and never once bothered to look past it. Until now. Until her, sitting beside him with nothing to gain, offering him the one thing his fortune had never been able to buy. The discovery came on an overcast afternoon, and Kelly felt the shift in the air before he understood its cause. He was kneeling among the roses when Clara Nordine's voice cracked across the garden like a whip, sharper and colder than anything he'd yet heard from her. "Explain yourself, Brenda." Now, Brenda stood frozen a few feet away, the woven basket still hanging from her arm, its cloth covering pulled back just enough to reveal the bread she'd meant to bring him. Clara advanced with quick, furious steps, her eyes darting between the basket and Kelly with a disgust that made no effort to disguise itself. "You've been stealing from my kitchen," Clara said, "for him. For that." She flung a hand toward Kelly as though he were something scraped from the bottom of a shoe. "Weeks, I'm told. Bread, cheese, honey, my honey, wasted on a filthy gardener who ought to be grateful for the dirt he sleeps in." "He was hungry," Brenda said, her chin lifting even as her voice trembled. "He's a person, Aunt Clara. He deserves." The slap came fast and sharp, cutting her sentence in half. Brenda's head turned with the force of it, a bright welt already rising along her cheek, and for a moment the entire garden seemed to hold its breath. Kelly moved before he could think better of it, half rising from the dirt, every instinct screaming at him to close the distance and put himself between them. But Brenda's hand shot out, quick and firm against his shoulder, holding him back before he could ruin everything. "Don't," she breathed, so quietly only he could hear it. Clara hadn't finished. "You will not humiliate this family further," she snapped, straightening her gloves as though the violence had cost her nothing. "One more loaf of bread, one more moment wasted on that creature, and I will see you out of this house without a coin to your name. Do you understand me?" "Yes, Aunt Clara," Brenda said, low and steady, though Kelly could see the tremble she was fighting to hold beneath her composure. Clara swept away without another glance at either of them, her silk skirts hissing against the stone path, leaving silence in her wake thick enough to choke on. Kelly reached for Brenda's hand the moment they were alone, gently turning her face to examine the mark blooming red along her cheek. "You should have let her think you'd stopped," he said, his voice rough with something he hadn't expected to feel so fiercely. "You didn't need to defend me." "Yes, I did," Brenda said simply, and there was no hesitation in it, no doubt. "Kindness isn't worth much if it disappears the moment it costs you something." Kelly looked at her then, truly looked, past the bruise and the trembling composure, and understood, with a certainty that startled him, that he had fallen in love with a woman who would rather bleed for her convictions than abandon them. Whatever walls he had built around his heart for years of calculated courtships crumbled quietly in that garden, buried beneath roses and the taste of stolen bread. That night, Kelly lay awake in the narrow servants' quarters he'd claimed as part of his disguise, staring up at the cracked ceiling while the events of the day replayed themselves without mercy. The sound of that slap, the tremor in Brenda's voice as she defended him, unflinching, though it had cost her a bruise, and the threat of everything she had left. He thought of her chin lifting even as tears gathered unshed in her eyes, of her hand pressed firm against his shoulder, holding him back from ruining the very secret she was protecting. He had built this deception to test the world's cruelty, never once expecting to find someone willing to bleed for kindness in the middle of it. He knew, lying there in the dark, that he could not continue the charade a single day longer than necessary. Not because the experiment had failed. It had succeeded beyond anything he'd imagined. But because every day he remained a starving gardener was another day, he asked Brenda to risk herself for a lie. She deserved better than a man hiding behind rags. She deserved the truth, delivered not in whispers over stolen bread, but plainly, fully, with all the weight and consequence it carried. But the truth could not simply be spoken. Not after Clara's cruelty. Not after the calculated contempt of an entire household that had treated him like refuse for weeks. If he was going to reveal himself, he intended to do it in a way that could never again be dismissed, ignored, or mocked. He wanted Clara Nordine to understand precisely what she had struck her niece for defending. He wanted Arthur to remember, with lasting discomfort, exactly whose gardening tools he had gleefully destroyed. Before dawn broke over the rose gardens, Kelly gathered the meager belongings of his disguise and slipped away from the estate without a word to anyone, least of all to Brenda, whose sleeping window he paused beneath for one long, aching moment before forcing himself to walk on. He told himself it would be a mercy, sparing her the danger of being seen with him one final time. He told himself many things that night, though the truth was simpler and harder to admit. He was afraid that if he saw her face, he would lose the resolve to leave it all. The journey back to his true estate took the better part of 2 days, dust and exhaustion clinging to him the entire way, hunger still gnawing faintly at his ribs even as the world around him shifted back into the trappings of wealth he'd left behind. His staff greeted his return with visible shock. Arthur, his butler, nearly dropping the silver tray he carried at the sight of his master, gaunt and filthy, striding through the front doors as though returning from war. "Prepare everything," Kelly said, already unbuttoning the ruined vest that had defined him for months. "The finest carriage. My father's blue coat. I intend to return to the Nordine estate within the fortnight, and this time, I mean for every soul there to remember exactly who walked among their roses." Word had reached the Nordine estate a full week before the carriage itself appeared. A letter bearing the unmistakable wax seal of Ravenscroft, announcing that the Duke intended to pay a visit while touring the countryside. The household had thrown itself into a frenzy of preparation ever since. Silver was polished until it gleamed painfully bright. The finest linens dragged from storage and pressed within an inch of their fibers, and Clara Nordine had personally overseen the rearrangement of an entire drawing room 3 separate times, convinced each previous arrangement insufficient for a man of such legendary wealth. No one in the household had ever laid eyes on the Duke of Ravenscroft. He was spoken of the way one speaks of myths, reclusive, staggeringly rich, having inherited a fortune so vast it was rumored to rival the crown's own coffers. He rarely appeared in society, avoided the marriage markets of London entirely, and had, over the years, become something of a ghost story exchanged between ambitious mothers hoping to secure him for their daughters. That such a man had chosen the Nordine estate for a visit sent the entire household into a spiral of desperate hope. This, Clara declared to her son over breakfast that morning, practically vibrating with anticipation, is precisely the opportunity this family has been waiting for. You will make yourself agreeable, Arthur. Charming, even. A man like the Duke does not extend such invitations twice. Arthur, for his part, seemed equally consumed by the prospect, already rehearsing polite conversation in the hallway mirror, adjusting his cravat for the dozenth time. Even Brenda, who had spent the months since Kelly's disappearance in quiet, aching silence, found herself swept into the frantic preparations, though her heart carried none of her family's excitement. She had grieved him in her own private way, not knowing his true name, not understanding why he had vanished without so much as a farewell, only the hollow certainty that whatever they had shared in the rose garden had ended as abruptly as it began. By mid-afternoon, the sound of hooves and carriage wheels echoed up the long gravel drive, and the entire household rushed to the front steps in a scramble of silk and nervous anticipation. The carriage that rounded the bend was unlike anything the estate had ever hosted, gleaming black lacquer trimmed in gold, drawn by 4 matched horses, footmen in crisp livery flanking its sides. Clara nearly wept with relief at the sight of it, smoothing her skirts and arranging her features into her most gracious smile. Brenda stood at the edge of the gathered family, half listening to her aunt's breathless instructions, her gaze drifting toward the rose garden beyond the drive out of habit more than intention. She had not yet looked at the carriage door when it opened. She had not yet seen the polished boot that stepped down onto the gravel, nor the man who followed it, tall, composed, dressed in blue and gold that caught the afternoon light like fire. She would only look up when his voice reached her, quiet and familiar beneath all its newfound grandeur, saying her name for the first time in months. Brenda. The name landed softly across the gravel drive, but it struck her like a shout. Her head lifted before she'd consciously decided to look, and for one suspended moment the world around her seemed to fall utterly silent. The murmuring household, her aunt's breathless greetings, the shuffling of footmen unloading trunks, all of it dimmed beneath the sound of a voice she had memorized in a garden months ago and never expected to hear again. He stood beside the carriage in a coat of deep midnight blue, gold embroidery tracing intricate patterns along its collar and cuffs, a family ring catching the afternoon light with every small movement of his hand. His dark hair was neatly combed, his jaw clean-shaven, his bearing so composed and commanding that for a heartbeat Brenda's mind refused the recognition entirely. This was not possible. This immaculate stranger, dressed in wealth so absolute it seemed to radiate from him, could not be the same gaunt, dirt-streaked man who had knelt trembling among the roses. But then she found his eyes. They hadn't changed at all. The same deep, searching brown she had looked into 100 times over stolen bread and quiet honesty. The same eyes that had watched her with such raw gratitude the first time she pressed a loaf into his shaking hands. Every polished layer of his transformation fell away in that instant, and beneath the gold and the title and the impossible grandeur, she saw him. Her gardener. The man she had grieved as lost. "No," she whispered, so quietly only the wind might have caught it. Her hand rose unconsciously to her mouth as the pieces assembled themselves with sickening clarity. His vanishing, his silence, the letter announcing a duke's visit that had thrown her entire household into a frenzy of hope. She had fed him, defended him, bled for him beneath her aunt's furious hand. And he had been a duke the entire time, watching her risk everything for a lie. Around her, the family's reaction unfolded in stark, humiliating contrast. Clara surged forward first, dropping into a curtsy so deep it nearly toppled her, her voice honeyed with a warmth Brenda had never once heard directed at anyone beneath her notice. "Your Grace, what an extraordinary honor. We are entirely at your service." Arthur straightened his cravat and offered a bow, already calculating, Brenda was certain, how such a connection might benefit him. Kelly's gaze never left Brenda's face. He walked past Clara's curtsy, past Arthur's outstretched hand, past every eager, grasping member of the household who had spent months treating him like refuse in their garden. He crossed the gravel drive until he stood before her, close enough now that she could see the exhaustion still faintly etched beneath his composed exterior, the same weariness she remembered from beneath the roses. "I owe you the truth," he said quietly, "and an apology far too many months overdue." Brenda said nothing. She only stared at him, betrayal and recognition warring plainly across her face, as the entire household looked on in stunned, uncomprehending silence. "Your Grace, you must be exhausted from your journey." Clara's voice cut through the tension with brittle brightness, her hand already extending toward the front steps in invitation. "Please, allow us to show you inside." "Brenda, dear, fetch some refreshment for our guest." "I did not come for refreshment," Kelly said, without turning from Brenda's face. "I came for her." The words landed heavily across the drive, and Brenda watched her aunt's expression falter, confusion flickering into something closer to alarm. Arthur stepped forward as though to intervene, some instinct toward damage control propelling him, but Kelly's gaze silenced him before he'd managed a single word. "You're him," Brenda said finally, her voice low and shaking. though she no longer bothered to keep it quiet. "The gardener. You knelt in that dirt for months, and let me believe." She stopped, pressing her hand hard against her mouth as though to physically hold the rest inside. But it broke free anyway, raw and furious. "Let me believe you were starving. Let me steal from my aunt's kitchen. Let me take a beating for defending you, while you were a duke the entire time. Was any of it real to you? Or was I simply an amusement, a peasant girl foolish enough to fall for a rich man's game?" "It was real," Kelly said, and something in his composed exterior finally cracked, the polished grandeur falling away to reveal the same aching honesty she remembered from beneath the roses. "Every conversation, every hour I spent hungry beside you. None of it was performance, Brenda. I came to this estate cynical and hollow, certain no one alive could look past a fortune to see the man beneath it. You proved me wrong within the first week. I stayed disguised because I was terrified that revealing the truth would poison the one honest thing I had left. You let me believe you had nothing," she said, tears finally breaking free down her cheeks. "You let me protect you when I had nothing to spare myself. I know." His voice cracked on the admission. "And I have no defense for the cruelty of that, except to tell you that everything I felt for you was never a lie. Only my circumstances were. I fell in love with you as a starving man kneeling in your kindness, and I have spent every day since trying to become worthy of returning to claim you honestly." Clara's voice rose again, sharper now, edged with panic. "Brenda, do not embarrass this family further. Your Grace, surely you understand she is confused." "She doesn't. She understands perfectly," Kelly said, finally turning, his eyes cold as they settled on Clara. "As does everyone here who watched her defend a starving man while the rest of you struck her for it." Brenda stood trembling amid the wreckage of her family's ambition, staring at the man who had broken her heart and somehow, impossibly, still held every piece of it. "I need the truth," she whispered. "All of it. No more disguises." "Then let me give it to you," Kelly said, extending his hand across the gravel. "For as long as you'll allow me the chance." Kelly's hand remained outstretched between them, steady despite everything trembling beneath his composed exterior, and for a long moment Brenda simply looked at it, at the same fingers that had once shaken while accepting bread from her, now adorned with a ring heavy with a title she had never asked for. "I don't want your apology dressed in gold," she said finally. "I want to know the man who knelt in the dirt. Is he still in there, beneath all this?" "He never left," Kelly said, and something in his voice broke entirely, all remaining pretense of ducal composure dissolving into raw honesty. "I built a fortress around myself for years, Brenda, convinced that everyone who approached me wanted only what I could give them. I turned that fortress into a cruel test, dressed as poverty, and I nearly lost the one person who proved my cynicism wrong. I was a coward for staying silent as long as I did. I was a coward for leaving without a word. I am asking you now, in front of everyone who ever made you feel small for your kindness, to forgive a man who let fear disguise itself as caution for far too long." Clara made a strangled sound of protest, already stepping forward with some renewed argument, but Kelly did not so much as glance her way. His eyes remained fixed entirely on Brenda, waiting, offering nothing but the plain, unguarded truth he had promised her. "You told me once," Brenda said softly, tears still tracing her cheeks, "that kindness isn't worth much if it disappears the moment it costs you something. I meant that. I still mean it. So I need to know, if I take your hand now, is this real? All of it. No more tests, no more disguises." "No more," Kelly said. "Only you, and whatever life we choose to build together, honestly." Brenda looked past him then, toward her aunt's furious, disbelieving expression, toward Arthur's slack-jawed calculation already curdling into resentment, toward the entire household that had spent months treating decency as a foolish, wasteful thing. She thought of every loaf of bread she had risked, every slap she had borne without regret, every quiet conversation shared among the roses that had asked nothing of her except honesty in return. She placed her hand in his. "Then yes," she said, her voice steadying with each word. "I'll come with you." The household erupted into a chorus of protest and scrambling apology, Clara's voice rising above the rest in a desperate bid to reclaim favor she had never deserved. But Kelly and Brenda were already walking toward the waiting carriage, her hand secure in his, neither of them sparing a backward glance. As the carriage pulled away down the long gravel drive, Brenda allowed herself one final look toward the rose garden where it had all begun, where a starving stranger had first taught her that true wealth had nothing to do with fortune and everything to do with the courage to be kind when kindness cost the most. If Kelly and Brenda's story of secret kindness and golden disguises moved you, hit like, drop a comment, and subscribe to Hearts Buried in Gold. More slow burn tales of hidden hearts and unearned love are on the way.